All right. As I promised, I posted the class from yesterday on the YouTube, and you can find a link to it on the class website, along with my written notes that I did, on the screen. So I hope that that's helpful to some folks. One thing that I forgot to mention when we were going over the syllabus last time. We're going to have a quiz every Friday at the beginning of class. Like I said last time, it's going to take like 10 or 15 minutes. We'll just show up, do the quiz for 10 minutes, and then go on with the rest of the class. There are some people from time to time who get have this accommodation about extra time on quizzes and tests. So if you are, if you feel like you might want extra time on the quizzes, please talk to me and we will arrange something. That's kind of difficult to do with the format that I just described. If we just all sit here for 10 minutes and do the quiz and then we all go on to the rest of the class. So let me know. We can work something out. I mean, this is something that is very common in the math classes that I teach. So I've been there before. It always works out, but let me know. We'll arrange something. All right. Great. Let's talk some more about voting. And I thought we should start by, I will tell you the results of our voting for the best movie ever. Remember that silly exercise we did? So I collected all of those 3 movies that you all told me about. I noticed that nobody chose any of the 3 movies that I chose. And that actually was typical. Most of the choices that you said, like you were the only one who said that choice. There weren't a lot of duplicates. But I took the liberty of combining your responses with the other class responses just so that we would get more sort of consensus. And there were 3 movies that 5 people wrote down. They are Interstellar, which was kind of surprising to me. I actually like this movie a lot, but Interstellar. I didn't think anybody saw that movie, or I didn't know that anybody liked it. It was kind of boring, which I liked. Another one that 5 people said was Titanic. Another one was, I actually have never heard of this movie, 10 Things I Hate About You. There were a lot of like 90s teen movies, which I didn't expect your demographic to be into the 90s teen movies, but all right. And then, so those were the 3 that had 5 different people wrote them down. And then there were 3 movies that had 4 different people wrote them down. And they were Forrest Gump, which is a good choice. I saw Forrest Gump in the theater when it came out. Can you believe that? With my high school girlfriend, which is why I never saw Forrest Gump again, and I don't really want to see it. Anyway. I wish her the best, though. And then the other 2 were The Godfather and Batman: The Dark Knight. 2 Christopher Nolan films. Amazing. Anyway, I thought, so to have a real election in which the result is kind of meaningful, it's best to have a ballot. I hope, and the reason is because if you don't have a ballot, you're likely to get like everybody just says something different, and then you can't really add those up in a meaningful way. I mean, just because 5 people said Interstellar, does that really mean that everybody here thinks that Interstellar is an awesome movie? I mean, maybe, but who knows? So I thought what I want to do is I want to do a runoff. A runoff is basically when you do an election which is somehow inconclusive for some reason, you narrow down the candidates to a smaller ballot, and then you do the election again and see if you get some kind of more conclusive result. So I would like to do a runoff with only 4 options, and these 4 that I wrote down. There was also, the Batman and the Godfather. I didn't want to have too many options on the ballot, so I just randomly chose Forrest Gump rather than those other 2. So this is going to be the runoff, right? Now, as we got to an example, like on that handout at the very end last time, that was an election in which all the voters ranked their choices. And I would like us to try and do it that way and see if we can judge this based on ranking the choices. So I want you all, right now, to rank the choices. Rather than you like sending this through Gradescope or giving me a bunch of papers, would you mind if I'm just going to ask you all to rank the choices, and then I'm just going to have I'm going to go around the room and have you all shout it out, and I'm going to write them down. All right? So here's what I want. I'm going to call these, I'll call this one I, this one T, this one H, I guess. I don't want T twice. And this one F, all right? So just write down for yourself, what is your ranking? I mean, you don't have to write it down, but I'm gonna like point at you in a moment, so know what you're gonna say. Don't take this too seriously. So my vote, this is my own personal ranking, is IFTH. I remember that Forrest Gump was a good movie. I actually never saw Titanic, and I never even heard of 10 Things I Hate About You, so I had to put that last. All right, this is my ranking. Don't judge me. I won't judge you. Everybody got it? So the first one, I'm gonna like point at you. The first one you say, just give me the 4 letters. The first one is the best, and the last one is the worst. All right. I'm going to write these down over here. I have already marked out my choice. You see here, these are all the possible choices that you could make, and I'm just gonna put a little mark next to whichever one you pick. All right. Are we ready? Maybe we can start over here, and we'll just go around. What do you say?
I do TFHI.
Okay.
IFTH.
Hey, all right. You agree with me.
THFI.
THFI. Okay.
I did FHTI.
All right.
FTHI.
Okay.
FHTI.
All right.
HTFI.
Okay. What is-
FITH.
All right. 5th.
FITH.
Okay.
IFTH.
All right.
FITH.
Okay.
IHTF.
IHGF. All right.
THFI.
This is fascinating, isn't it?
TFHI.
TFHI. Okay.
HFTI.
Okay.
ITFH.
All right.
FTHI.
ITFH.
Okay.
HTFI. HTFI.
All right.
HTFI.
Okay.
HTFI.
Ooh. All right.
THFI.
Okay.
HTI.
FH. All right. And back there.
HTFI.
That's a popular choice.
THFI.
FTHI.
All right.
TIFH.
Okay.
HTFI.
Mm-hmm.
HTFI.
Mm-hmm.
FTIH.
FTIH. All right. Thank you for that. They're gonna love that on the YouTube. Looks like a lot of people said HTFI. I mean, not really a lot. 8 out of there's like 35 people in the class. I don't know if everybody's here today, but you might be tempted to just look at this and say, well, HTFI is the winner. Although we're not really going to try to make the conclusion in that way, just because we would like to somehow combine all of these together in a more intelligent way than just looking at this one got the most votes right here. All right, because for example, it looks like 9 people put H first, but more than that put F first. So maybe like the true answer should have F as being first, right? You have thoughts about it? No. Okay. He was putting his hand around. Yeah. So okay. Anyway, this is I'm going to compile these results, and we'll talk about those next time or some other time. All right. Great. Let's go on with it then. Where was I? All right. So at the end last time, we were looking at the election on this handout here. I don't know if you brought it with you. It's actually not super important if you didn't bring it. Oh, I have it here. As you're looking at that page, what's important, like I said last time, is really the chart on the bottom. And I will just in case anybody doesn't have it, I will write The chart on the bottom said 14 A, B, C, D, 10 C, B, D, A, 8 D, C, B, A, 4 B, D, C, A, and 1 C, D, B, A. All right, this is a summary of the ballots, and actually I'm gonna, all those little like tick marks that I just did, I'm gonna translate that into a chart that looks like this, which is a little more readable. What this means, the first column here means that 14 people said A, then B, then C, then D. 10 people said C, B, D, A, and so on. All right, and we only had like a couple minutes at the very end last time to discuss this, but I think something that we ended up pointing out is that if we only consider the first position votes, if we only consider the first place votes, then it seems pretty clear that A is the winner of this election, right? Because A got 14 votes in the first position. Then I'll say they look like this. If I were to just give sort of the totals, but only considering the first position, A has 14, right? B has 4. There were 4 people who put B in the top position. C is a little tricky one. C actually has 11. You can see these 10 people put C in the top position, and also this one person put C in the top position. So C has a total of 11 votes, placing them in the top position, and then D has 8 from that middle column there. All right, and so I would just say, according to this, if we only consider the first position votes, then A should win, all right? Because they have more than everybody else. And I think at the very end last time, somebody pointed out that, that's all fine if you only consider the first position votes. But if you look a little bit more carefully at the chart here, you will notice that A is on the very bottom of everybody else's ballot. And there were 37 total voters here. 14 of them liked A the best. Everybody else, which would be 23 other people, thought that A was the worst. And so there's something kind of unjust about making A the winner in this scenario, all right? Although if you're not going to make A the winner, who else are you going to make the winner? I mean, looking at this, it's not obvious at all what the proper choice is. If you think A might not be the correct choice, then what is the correct choice? Well, there's nothing clear about that. So I'm going to say this is one way to do it, but not obviously the best way. It is one way that you could choose the winner as A, but there are reasons in this example that maybe A is not the correct choice. So can I just say there is no obvious correct way to choose the winner in this kind of election, right? You could just consider only the first place votes and then you choose the winner that way, but that method doesn't actually get you a great result in some situations, right? For instance, this one right here on the paper. So what we're going to talk about for the next few weeks, actually, there are several methods that people have come up with over time. There are several methods that are all different. None of them is like the right way to do it. There isn't really a right way to do it. There are just different methods that sometimes they give you good results, sometimes they give you bad results. There's several methods. I'll just say something like there's pros and cons to each. And you can look at different democratic societies. They have, in general, settled down into one or more of these methods, which we, in the United States, everybody knows, we basically only consider people's first choice, right? In fact, when you vote in a typical election in the US, they don't ask you about any of your other opinions. You just vote for who do I think is the best, right? So in the American system kind of works just like this, right? Which, that's a way to do it. But there are other ways that you could have done it. And there are some situations like this one where this way is not really, not necessarily making the best conclusion based on the opinions of the people. All right, anyway, I want to talk about different systems for voting. We're going to talk about like 4 or 5 different ways that you could choose the winner of an election like this. So before we get to the details of that, I want to just talk about some notations. We've already seen notation for examples, right? Let me just say, we're going to be doing a lot of specific examples where like I tell you what all the votes were, and then I say, you tell me who should win this election using this or that method, right? So typically we're going to write things just like we did before, something like 25 A, B, C, 37 B, A, C. Usually in my examples it's going to be A's and B's just because I don't feel like making up names or other things like that. All right, here's a typical example that we're going to look at. Remember, what this means is 25 people ranked A first and then B and then C. 37 said B, then A, then C. 38 said A, then C, then B. There are other things that people could have said, but apparently in this example, nobody said, for instance, B, C, A. That wasn't anybody's opinion. All right? Now, I would say, just looking at this particular example, anybody feel like one of them is like a clear winner? Is there, or is there some kind of ambiguity? Anybody have feelings about this? Yeah?
Would be A.
Yeah, in this case, I would say A seems pretty strong. You got all of these people and all of these people think A is the best. That's already more than half of the voters think that A is the best. These people put A in the second position. It's not so bad, right? So I would say here, this is very like kind of wishy-washy, but I would say here, A seems very strong, right? In fact, a majority of the voters thought that A is the best. So I would say any reasonable democratic system, if a majority of the voters think that somebody is the best, then that person should probably win the election, no matter how you think about adding the votes up. All right, so I'll just say A seems very strong in this case. Here's an example where it's very difficult. Sometimes it's hard/impossible to decide who's the strong one. Here's an example. Let's say 3 people said A, B, C. Usually I'm going to use small numbers just because it's easier to think about. 3 people said B, C, A. 3 people said C, A, B. All right? This is just another made-up example. Who's the best this time? Well, this one, if you look carefully, you will become confused about the people's opinions here. Check it out. In this particular example here, sometimes a good way to think about this is by comparing the candidates in pairs. So even though there are 3 candidates total here, in trying to think about this, I could think about, like, what if it was just A versus B? Then who would win if it was just A versus B? That is, if I ignore the C's here, what I have is 3 people like A above B, these 3 people like B above A, and these 3 people also like A above B. So if it was just A versus B, it looks like 6 people like A better and 3 people like B better, right? So here, let me say, in A versus B, if I ignore the C's temporarily, I will say 2/3 prefer A, right? That is the 3 people in the first column and the 3 people in the last column, they prefer A. Whereas the people in the middle, they prefer B versus A, all right? And maybe we'll just like look at each possible. What about A versus C, and what about B versus C? What I'm doing is I'm looking at this, but I'm considering only A. Now, when I'm talking about A versus C, look at this, but ignore the B's, and see what happens when I consider only A versus C. I have these people like A better than C, these people like C better than A, these people like C better than A. So again, this time C, 2/3 of the people prefer C rather than A, right? So, okay, 2/3 prefer C. And what about B versus C? If I look at this chart here and I temporarily ignore the A's, I get these three people like B above C, these three people also like B above C, these people like C above B. So B is beating C 2/3 of the time. 2/3 prefer B when we do that. All right? This can sometimes help you to understand which of the candidates is stronger than the other ones if you just look at them sort of 2 by 2. All right? But actually, in this particular example, it doesn't really help to understand. Let me just sort of summarize what I just said. What I said was 2/3 prefer A over B. That's what the first line says. 2/3, I'm going to write the last one next. 2/3 prefer B over C. So it's like most people like A better than B, and also most people like B better than C. And also 2/3 prefer C over A. All right. If you think about this, this is pretty whack. If you ask me, it says most people like A better than B, and they also like B better than C, and they also like C better than A. That actually doesn't really make any sense. This is not something that an individual person would never express a preference in this way. Like, I like apples better than bananas, and I like bananas better than coconuts, and I like coconuts better than apples. That actually doesn't make any sense for a person to say that, for an individual person. But when you consider the opinions of a group as a whole, a group can actually have that kind of nonsensical opinion, right? They like A better than B, and B better than C, and C better than A. This is like a circular thing, which doesn't make any kind of logical sense for an individual person to feel that way. But the group as a whole feels that way. So I would say in this case, when you're trying to judge, like, you know, the big question of like doing voting at all is like to figure out what is the will of the people, right? In this particular example, which I just made up, but this could happen in the real world, right? This is not an unrealistic example. In this example, it's like the people don't really have a will. Like, each individual person has a will. But when you try to combine them all together, you don't get any kind of logical group opinion, right? There is no opinion of the group in this example. What is the will of the people? I would say they don't have a will, right? Each person individually has an opinion, but there is no way in this case to combine them into a logically coherent opinion of the whole group, all right? I would say if you had never heard of voting before and you saw this, I think a reasonable conclusion is like, all right, well then voting is stupid. Like, if there are situations in which a group just doesn't have any opinion at all, or in which the group's opinion makes no logical sense, why would you even want to decide things by voting if it's possible for a group to have no logical, coherent opinion? Like I said, I'm not trying to be a voting skeptic. I believe in the power of voting, but it is not as simple as people are led to believe. That's all I'm trying to say. All right. There's actually a name for this kind of scenario. This is named after a person who first kind of wrote about this in an academic setting. This is called the Condorcet. This is a French sort of mathematician, politician who lived in the 1700s. The Condorcet paradox. The Condorcet paradox, and this is a guy named Condorcet, and he wrote about this sort of thing. He realized that there are certain situations in which a group of people expressing what are individually rational opinions, but when you try to combine all the opinions of the group, you don't get anything that makes any logical sense. So the Condorcet paradox, if I were to say it like in words, it means that individual preferences make sense. Group preferences, which I will put in quotes, group preferences sometimes don't make sense. sometimes when you try to judge the preference of the entire group, what you get is something which is not logical at all. It doesn't make any logical sense. Actually, Condorcet said this in more technical mathematical terms, which I hope you don't mind if I say. Individual preferences, individuals, I'm not saying individual people are crazy. I'm saying it's kind of crazy when you try to combine all their opinions together. Individual preferences are transitive. This is a fancy word, which maybe you learned this word at some point in your life. I have 2 kids in middle school, and I think they know what this word transitive means. Maybe it's something that you learn and forget. Anybody happen to remember what transitive means in a mathematical context?
I remember the transitive property.
Yeah.
And I think it's one thing carries over to the next, something like that.
Yeah, it has to do with inequalities. Anybody else remember this? It's called the transitive property of, sometimes it's used for the equal sign. It says, like, if x equals y and y equals z, then x equals z. It's more important, the version of that for inequality. So individual preferences are transitive. It means if something like, I'll use A's and B's just because that's what I'm doing last time. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. In the context of voting, what it means is if I prefer A better than B and I also prefer B better than C, then that kind of automatically means that I like A better than C. This is called the transitive property. And this is, in general, a true fact about the way that individual people behave, is that my preferences are transitive. If I like one thing better than another and the other better than some other, then I like the first thing better than the last thing. All right? So this is how Condorcet, in a more technical way, would say the Condorcet paradox is that individual preferences are transitive, but group preferences may be non-transitive. And that's the example that we just said up there, right? Here, most people prefer A over B and also B over C and also C over A, which doesn't, in an ordinary logical framework, that doesn't make any sense. Even if the individual people are making sense, like on their own, the group preferences do not make sense. This is a major sort of philosophical problem with just the idea of voting, right? There are some situations in which groups of people, in which it's really impossible to come up with something like the will of the people. All right. Anyway, we just have to deal with this, right? This is like I said last time, this sort of cute quote about the democracy is the worst system of government except for all the other ones that we've tried. I'm not trying to say that voting is a bad idea. I'm just saying, like, there are logical issues that we just have to deal with. They're not going to go away. Okay. So anyway, big questions here. Oops. That we're going to be talking about for the next couple weeks. So, what different methods can we use to choose the winner? Use to choose the winner? There are many different methods. They're called voting systems. So when I say the words voting system, that means some particular method by which you look at the ballots and decide who the winner is. All right? These are called voting systems. And in particular, what we're talking about is sometimes called ranked voting systems. That's because I'm specifically talking about elections in which the voters rank their choices. All right. The next sort of big question is how can we judge which methods are better? Right. If I said, hey, I got 5 different ways that we could possibly decide the outcome of this election, how would you know which one to actually use or which one is better than any of the other ones? All right. And then if you understand something about how you can judge which is better, then maybe that would help you to design a new system which really is better, right? But before you try to make a good system, you have to understand, like, what do I even mean by good? Like, what exactly am I looking for in a good voting system, all right? So we're going to talk a lot about that. Different systems, and then also different criteria for judging which one is better than other ones in various situations. All right, let's get down to our first example of a voting system. That is a method for deciding who the winner should be. And this is the simplest one. A simple voting system. Remember, voting system means a method to decide the winner. It's called plurality. Like I said, we're going to talk about like 4 or 5 different systems. This is the simplest one. This is the easiest one. And this is the one that we are all most familiar with. This is the one in which you ignore everything except the top position. You look only at the first place votes. So in a plurality election, whoever gets the most first place votes is the winner. All right? This is basically how we do it in the United States. Most elections in the US are run in this way. And if you're going to run an election in the real world like this, where all you care about is the first choice, then you don't even have to ask anybody what their opinions are about anything else. You just ask them, what's your top pick? And then you add them all up, and that person becomes the winner. All right? So, for example, in this election here, this is an example I wrote a few minutes ago. 25 people say ABC. 37 people say ACB. 38 people say BAC. Who's the winner? Using plurality. All right? From now on, I'm never going to show you an election and just ask you who's the winner. If I just say who's the winner, you should say, well, which method do you want me to use? Well, plurality is what I'm talking about right now. This is the only method we know so far. But anyway, who's the winner using the plurality method? Well, to do that, you just have to count up the first place votes for each of the 3 candidates. Now, given the columns there, is this the same as the one I wrote? I think it's not the same. It looks similar. Sorry. I wrote it down differently. It doesn't matter. Who is the winner using the plurality system? C gets 0 votes in the first position. Nobody here puts C up top, right? B is going to get 38. And A gets these many, 25 plus 37, whatever that is. I'm a mathematician. I'm not much of an accountant. Actually, you will see this going forward in this class. I'm not terribly good at adding and multiplying numbers in my head. That's not what a mathematician does all day long. And anyway, I can tell that number is the biggest, though. This is the most. So A wins. If we use plurality, right? All right, the plurality system totally ignores all of the other rankings that people gave, right? It just looks at the top line and adds up the votes. One thing that I would like to point out, sorry, I'll point this out in a moment. Could we use anybody got any questions about this? I think this is very simple. I hope you agree with me. Could we decide the example on the big handout using the plurality system? I'm not going to write it down again, but the big handout example, using the plurality system. What do we get? If you look at the chart on the bottom, you have to add up the votes. And actually, I wrote this down at the beginning even. If you just add up the top position votes, A has 14 from the first column, B has 4 from the fourth column, C has 11, that is 10 from the second column plus the one at the end, and then D has 8. And so A is the winner using the plurality system. All right? This is how the plurality system works. An important thing to notice about the plurality system, note, to win, you don't need a majority. So I'm going to be a little picky about the language here. The word majority means more than half, right? More than 50%. More than 50%. Now, in this particular example here, there were 37 total voters. And so a majority in that example would constitute half of that, rounding up, half of 37. You do got to go to 38 if you want to divide by 2. That's 19, right? So 19 is a majority in this example. And A was the winner, but they got less than 19. So I'm just pointing out, to win in a plurality election, you don't need a majority. And majority, the technical meaning is more than 50%. I will say you just need it's called a plurality. And what plurality means, it doesn't mean more than half, it just means more than anybody else, right? That's called a plurality. It means you got more than anybody else got, which is different from getting more than a half. Obviously, if you do get more than a half, then you automatically get more than everybody else got, but the other way around is not necessarily true. All right. Could we decide the movies by plurality? We can do this. I mean, I didn't compile it into a convenient chart here, but it's not so hard to look at this with the tally marks and decide who wins this using the plurality system. It means you just have to see which movie got put in the first position more often than any others. I helpfully grouped these into 4 groups. So these are the ones who said I first, these are the T first, and so on. It looks like H first, there's 9 of them. F first, that's more than 9, and these are not more than 9, right? So F first is most often. F is most often first. So here I'm going to say F wins with the plurality, because there are more people who put Forrest Gump first than anything else, all right? I believe this is not a majority, though. It's not that a majority of people thought that Forrest Gump was the best. It's just they got more than the other the movies. All right, that is called the plurality system. That was here. All right. And let me just say that, like I said before, everybody knows this. The United States generally uses plurality, right, for our political elections. And really, if you're among Americans and trying to make a decision in a group, and somebody says, hey, why don't we vote on it? Probably what they mean is, why don't we use the plurality system? They probably are not thinking about any kind of other more complicated way of deciding. Usually when Americans talk about voting, all they can conceive of is the plurality system. This is like the only way that people vote in America, usually, all right? We have some, like when we elect the president, it's basically the plurality, but we also have the Electoral College, which is a weird sort of, you're really doing 50 different plurality elections and then somehow adding up the Electoral College votes, which is strange. But anyway, it's basically a bunch of plurality elections that we do to elect the president. But that's only to elect the president. All of our other elections are generally using the plurality system. All right. Sorry, my papers are out of order here. Yes. So what that means in our politics, since the United States uses the plurality system, it's possible. This is one sort of basic fact about how the plurality system works. It's possible for a candidate to win without a majority liking them, right? In fact, you can win the presidential election in America even if a majority of the people don't like you, which is pretty weird, but that's actually possible. And this has happened. There's one example that actually I'm going to come back to fairly often, a real historical example. And since you guys are really into high school 90s movies, maybe this example will be relevant. This is a real example. I want to talk a little bit about the 2000 U.S. presidential election. In the year 2000, 1 year after the release of 10 Things I Hate About You, I think that was from, I looked it up because I was shocked that everybody liked this movie that I never heard of. All right. The U.S. presidential election in the year 2000, anybody happen to know who the candidates were? You know who the winner was?
George Bush and Al Gore.
Yeah, this was George W. Bush versus Al Gore. Bush was the Republican. He was the governor of Texas and the son of the previous Republican president. George Bush and Al Gore was the vice president for Bill Clinton, and they were in a heated battle for the presidency. This was, I suppose, similar to the Trump versus Biden election. The result was not immediately clear on the day of the election. Usually, everybody kind of knows the result on that day. But in the year 2000, it was too close to call. The votes were too close to call in the great state of Florida. There were the votes were more or less settled in all of the other states, and the other states all counted up their electoral college votes, and it turned out that Florida was undecided. Florida has a pretty big population, and all the other electoral votes were close enough so that it came down to Florida. Whoever was going to win in Florida would become the next president. So the votes were too close to call in Florida, and all of the other electoral votes, they were more or less even, so that whoever was going to win Florida would win the election. So the Florida vote would decide the election. Back then, all these votes were done on paper. I don't know if you ever heard of this. It was a totally crazy situation that happened when people were trying to decide who was the winner for this election. Eventually, though, they counted the votes, and as you all know, Bush became the president, and Al Gore made a PowerPoint presentation. That was his movie about the global warming, which is good, a good documentary, although it's basically just a big PowerPoint presentation. The votes, when you counted them up, the final count was, you will be amazed when you see these numbers. I think you will. Bush, who I'm writing with a B, got this many votes. This is just in the state of Florida, because that's what mattered. 2,912,790. And Gore, in the great state of Florida, got 2,912,253. That is ridiculously close. In fact, this is far closer than the margin of error when you're just counting this many votes. When you're counting like 6 million votes, you expect the answers to be off by 1,000 here or there, right? Just by random chance. And this is within the margin of error of the vote counting. Something interesting about this, there was another guy on the ballot. When we have presidential elections, there's always other people on the ballot who basically nobody votes for, and they don't really have a big effect on the election. The other guy was Nader, Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader got 97,421 votes. All right. It would be accurate to say that after this election, a lot of people were angry with Nader because Nader was blamed to a large extent for making Gore lose the election. All right. So anyway, Bush wins, right? because we're doing the plurality system, or at least within the state of Florida, all we care about are these three numbers, their top choices. Bush wins, and Gore lost. But if you know something about the politics of these three guys, Bush was the Republican, so he's sort of a conservative. That's American politics is usually described in this sort of oversimplified conservative versus liberal thing. Bush is conservative. Gore was the liberal Democrat. And if you're going to analyze things in terms of conservative versus liberal, Nader would have been viewed as some kind of radical, extreme liberal. He's not really radical, but he's sort of even more liberal than the Democrats. All right, so Nader is super liberal. Trump would have called him the radical left. He likes to call everybody the radical left. But, I mean, there is such a thing as someone who's like more liberal than somebody else. If anything, Nader was more liberal than Gore, all right? This is interesting because it's likely, because of this sort of, Nader was like the super liberal, the Nader voters really hated Bush, all right? People who voted for Gore, presumably they didn't like Bush. That's why they voted for Gore. The Nader people, though, they're like even further from Bush than Gore is, all right? So it is, I mean, this is probably not true to down to the person, but nobody would disagree politically with what I'm saying here. The people who voted for Nader, it is likely that they really hated Bush. They decided to vote for Nader rather than Gore for whatever reason, but it's likely that the Nader voters hated Bush. This is why people were so mad at Nader, because when you look at these totals here, all these Nader people, they probably would have preferred that Gore would win rather than Bush. But because they voted for Nader, they kind of made Gore lose, even though Gore was their preferred choice between the other two guys, all right? This was very upsetting to the Nader people and to the Gore people especially. They were like, "Come on, Ralph! Nader totally screwed Gore in this scenario here. If Nader had just not been on the ballot, it's fair to assume that all, or at least the majority of these Nader people, their votes would have gone to Gore instead, and then Gore would have won the election. All right. To say this another way. It's reasonable, this is speculation, of course. It's reasonable to think if they ranked their choices, it would have been like this. You had basically 2.9 million people who said Bush. Now, if you had asked the Bush people to, instead of, in reality, they just said, I like Bush the best. That's how you vote. But if you had asked them instead to rank their choices, given the political spectrum, probably between Bush, Gore, and Nader, they would have said Bush and then Gore, then Nader. Because Nader is the far liberal sort of outsider. And the Bush people would have never wanted Nader, all right? Like I said, this is speculation, but I mean, you can read about this. Essentially, nobody would argue with what I'm about to say here, and I'm certainly not trying to input my own sort of political speculations here. It's also pretty clear that the Nader people, which was like 97,000, they would have put Nader, then Gore, then Bush. That's because the Nader people are sort of super liberals, and they definitely would not have liked Bush. They would have liked Gore better than Bush. And then the the Gore voters is another 2.9 million. The Gore voters, actually, in the case of the Gore voters, it's not so clear. I mean, they liked Gore the best, of course. That's why they voted for him. As far as who their second choice would have been, maybe some of them would have liked Nader better than Bush. Maybe some of them would have liked Bush better than Nader. The Gore people were kind of like in the middle as far as this spectrum goes. And it's not so obvious which way they would have gone on their second choice. I'm going to write it like this. So this is definitely not accurate here, but I'm saying this in a way, this is generous to Bush, right? I'm just going to assume that all the Gore people, they would have liked Bush better than Nader, which is probably not true in the real world. All right. But anyway, what I would like to, I know it's time to go. I would just like to note that a majority likes Gore better than Bush. That's what I'm trying to say in this example. Many people view this election as a failure of the plurality system. Like the people who wanted Gore to win say that the plurality system failed to choose the correct candidate. The Bush people would more likely say, hey, this is the rules. Everybody knew the rules of this election before we did it, so there's no fair complaining after the fact if you lost by the numbers. All right, that's the plurality. See you tomorrow.